and will be shown to you in the next hour with a couple of presentations that will be given also by Manuel Lorenzo and by Giada Landi that will follow me in this webinar. The agenda for this webinar today, after my short introduction, will go then through the presentation from Manuel that will give us a very short update on the roadmap and the status of the 5G platform. And this will be then followed, as said, by the live demo of the 5G portal and the validation framework by Giada Landi, that is our Deputy Technical Manager from Nextworks, that has worked in particular on the preparation of this demo for the Mobile World Congress. At the end of our webinar, we will have time for very few questions and answers session on the platform and the portal. So just some remarks before giving the talk to our two speakers. So first of all, be advised that this webinar will be recorded and will be then uploaded to the 5G internet website. Secondly, if you have questions, please do not interrupt the speaker, but write them in the chat of WebEx. We will record them, and some of them will be answered at the end. And finally, please mute your microphones during the presentations in order to allow everything to go smoothly. As said, if you have questions, please use the chat. After a few details, if you will be interested in our presentation, please do not forget also to subscribe to our newsletter that we publish regularly. You can find here the address, and also you can follow us on the Twitter channel that you can see on the screen. So now it's time to give the talk to Manuel. So Manuel, please, if you start sharing your presentation, we can go through it.
Sure, I'm starting to share in my screen. And what we are going to do before we start with the actual purpose of the presentation today, the live demo of the platform of 5G, we're going to give a few coordinates on where we are and what is coming in our plan of the project. Basically, and as you know, because we are assuming that you have a knowledge on the 5G project, we are basically addressing three main objectives. One is to deploy a full 5G enabled platform updated to the latest release of all the features of this technology. Then we have created a number of added value features accessible through a portal for third parties who want to experiment and launch their tests with us. And on top of that, and not shown in the picture, we are already executing a number of use cases from a variety of verticals who are partners themselves in 5G. So that's the general context. Before I can go into a little bit more detail, these are only the highlights of the roadmap of 5G, which is structured, as you can see, in slots of 6 months. We have gone last year through the opening of the lab for high-touch experimentation to verticals in May 2019. By the end of last year, we consolidated Release 15, 5G radio, and massive MIMO network slicing, and we support enhanced mobile broadband in all the 4 sites, making up the constellation of 5G platform. And as you can see below, we have deployed the first functionality for external use through a portal with limited but quite interesting and usable functionality already. It's been under use and it will be demonstrated today. We also care a lot about how you can measure the performance of the network and your application. And we are adding monitoring of a variety of KPIs of 5G all along the project. So today we support measurements of user data rate, latency, and reliability. And we are consolidating also the interconnection between the sites, enabling that all tests that you can define can be run in a similar, regardless the specific site you're running your experiment, and also that you can benefit from multi-site experience if that is required by your use case. Okay, so that's for what we have today, and the big step ahead towards July 2020 is that we consolidate also ultra-reliable communications, still release 15 in all sites, and we complete the development and deployment of the testing portal and add new KPIs and provide this full interworking. So that is the moment that we are super glad to open our doors, not only to our partner verticals in 5G, but to ICT19 projects and others who have established a commitment or a handshake with us to cooperate. That's a little bit what is happening between now and the next 6 months. The project will continue, of course, towards the end of the year with the consolidation of release 16 and the completion of all the features, and we will deliver a full-fledged platform and framework by mid next year. The important thing for us is that we can focus on the concrete activities and in the collaboration that we can have with you. So let me just outline a few messages here. Of course, we are in the platform validation. We're checking all the KPIs of our platforms, and all our verticals in the consortium are experimenting their use cases. We are opening with this webinar and with more activities coming by April, training to everyone interested in using our platform. We are supporting to basically all ICT19 projects with their task of specification planning and integration support already. And we will be cooperating with all of them in the integration and their experimentation on top of our platforms. In parallel with that, we continue the development of the platform. And as I was commenting, if we can give a simple highlight of the achievements that we expect to have by July 2020, that will be the full set of platform services. And for January 2021, that we are compliant with release 16. So that is the context for today's meeting. We think it's a good moment to open, share, and welcome you and invite you to our next training sessions, and of course to continue the collaborations we have with the different open approved ICT19 projects. Given that context, and going to the important section of this presentation, I would like to hand over to Giada for going into the details, not today on the 5G capabilities, but on the platform functions that you can use to run your experiments with us. So thank you for that. And Giada, now the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So let me share the screen. So I hope you can see my slides. Basically, we will go through a brief introduction of the 5G experimentation workflows, trying to define which are the roles that we have defined in the project for the access to our platform. I will give some basic information about the measure concept and terminologies that we are using in defining our experiments, and all the functionalities that will be made available and are available now on the 5G portal. Then we will go through the demo for the experimenters. So this slide represents the entire life cycle of an experiment in 5G, starting from the initial design of the experimentation that you want to perform over our platform, and going through the preparation of the environment, the customization of the test, their execution, monitoring, and finally the validation. of the results and of the performance. So the design is the initial step that allows you to define the components of your service. And of course, you will be able to reuse several of the tools that will be made available in the 5G portfolio to help you in the definition of the experiment. You can also bring your own applications, virtual applications or virtual network functions, and you can create what we call the blueprints of the experiment, that are a sort of templates that gives the basic information about the kind of experiment that you want to perform on the platform. Starting from these blueprints that are usually prepared by experiment developers, the experimenter can configure the specific instance of the experiment, defining the specific settings using a number of tools that we will see in our demo, and that can be based on an intent of the experimenter, or you can, for example, using a wizard that is made available in our portal. After this, you are ready to request the scheduling of your experiment, selecting a desired time slot that will be validated by the personnel in 5G, and in particular by our site managers. The site managers will be also responsible to prepare the physical environment that will host your experiments, and then everything will be ready for you to build your virtual environment, execute the test, monitor the progress of the experiment, and visualizing the monitoring data. For example, the metrics, the logs, the KPIs, the performance of your system, basically. Using also a number of diagnostic tools that can be adopted, for example, for troubleshooting or for tuning your service configuration. So let's move now to the roles that we have defined in 5G. So who is in charge of what in our environment? Of course, we have the concept of the vertical that is the actor with the knowledge, the prime knowledge of the service itself that must be tested. And we have also the role of who is developing, let's say, the applications for the verticals. And in this case are the verticals VNF providers that are also the ones that will provide the VNF packages, for example, for the vertical applications. And then we have the two main roles in our system that are actually the experiment developer and the experimenter. So the experiment developer is actually the actor with a deep knowledge both on the service that must be tested, but also on the environment where this service must be tested. So it will be the responsible for the specification of all the blueprints associated to an experiment, and also the service descriptors that will enable their deployments. The experimenter, on the other hand, is responsible for executing the experiments and for assessing the results. So it defines basically the characteristics of each instance of the experiments that must be executed, and it will request the deployment of the virtual environment and the analysis of the KPIs, results, metrics, and so on. Finally, the site manager, that is an internal role in 5G site and will probably be one of the major contact points for you to interact with our system. And the site manager are actually the responsible for the administration of the different sites that we have in the project and in our platform. So let's move now to the major concepts for the definition of an experiment. As we have mentioned before, the first thing to do to design an experiment is to define its blueprint. The blueprint is a sort of template, a sort of high-level representation of an experiment that is built by the experiment developers and includes a number of items, as you can see here. So the first thing is the vertical service blueprint. that defines the components of the service that you want to test, how they are interconnected, how you can configure them, and how you can decide the dimension for the different service component through some service level parameters, and the application metrics that you can collect for that service. Then you have the context blueprint. The context blueprint, on the other hand, defines a sort of operational context or experimental condition that you can use to execute your experiment. For example, you could define some artificial background traffic or some artificial delay, and they will allow you to test your service in different conditions in order to compare the performance and then tune accordingly your service to different deployment situations. You have the test case blueprints that defines the scripts that will run to execute the experiment together with the related configuration. And finally, the network service descriptor that defines how the service must be deployed and how the experiment with all its components must be deployed within the virtual infrastructure that will be made available in the 5G environment. Finally, you can define also an additional number of items still related to the experiment that are basically the target site, where you want to run your experiment, the infrastructure metrics that can be collected, and the KPIs that you want to validate. Starting from the blueprints, you can define your descriptor. The descriptor defines the characteristics of the specific instance of experiment that you want to run. And that's here that the experimenter can provide the specific target values for the service parameters defined in the experiment blueprint. Internally, of course, it's again composed by several descriptors for the vertical service, for the context, and for the test cases. So, in short, how to run an experiment in 5G once the blueprint is already available. You need to select your target site. So we have the French site, the Spanish site, the Greek site, and the China site. So you need to select the target for running your experiment. You need to select the blueprint. Starting from the blueprint, you can provide the specific values to define your descriptor, select the time slot when you want to run your experiment, wait a bit for the site configuration, that is an offline procedure that will be performed by the site manager, and finally you can instantiate your experiment and start with your experiment execution and whatever you want to do with your virtual environment. Well, this is just the home page of the 5G portal that we will see in our demo. Basically, we have these 4 blocks that are designed for the different actions that you can do on the portal itself. So we can start from the experiment design, that is a task of the experiment developer. Then we can go to the request of the experiment, providing a customization and the scheduling that you want. Finally, you can monitor and execute your experiment, so what's happening in your virtual environment. And finally, we have a section that is dedicated to the management of the sites for the site manager in 5G. Our demo today will basically focus on the experiment request, configuration, execution, monitoring. So the role of the experimenter in 5G. So let's now start with the demo. Okay. So this is the login page. So basically you need to enter your username and password to log in here, of course. If you don't have credential, you need to register a new user. You can do that still from the portal using this form. So you will need to provide, of course, some values that will allow the system to validate your request. The validation and the registration is an offline procedure that will be performed by the 5G personnel. So when you receive the confirmation of your registration, you will be able to access the portal. As you can see here, you can also choose your role, as we have discussed previously. Okay. Now let's log in and let's start. So this is the home page that we have also seen before. Here you can access all the functionalities to handle a 5G experiment lifecycle. So from the design here to the configuration, the deployment, the management, and the validation. Now, for simplicity, we have logged with a super user that has been created for demo purposes. So this user has all the roles defined in 5G. So basically, he can access all the functionalities. This is the reason why here all the boxes that you see are fully active. If you log in with a user that has a single role, of course, only the enabled functionalities will be activated. But let's go more into the details of each box. So the design experiment, the green one, is used basically to define the blueprints of the experiment, as we have seen in the previous slide. So the blueprints that are sort of templates, and you will be able to describe all the different aspects of an experiment. This section will be mostly used by an experiment developer. Okay. The more interesting parts for the experimenters are the request experiment box here, the yellow one, and the manage experiment box here, the red one. So the yellow one here is used to request the scheduling of a new experiment instance with the possibility to customize the configuration. And we will see this later. This can be done, for example, through the intent-based tool or through the definition of the experiment descriptor. Now, when you request the scheduling of a new experiment, the site manager will need to take care of some actions to be executed offline and manually. So, for example, to check the feasibility of the proposed time slot, to prepare the environment, and so on. Okay, so this may involve some time, let's say. You will be to be a bit patient, let's say, and wait for the 5G if people working for you. And then you can follow the status of your experiment using the red section here, manage your experiment. So you will see the status, and as soon as everything is ready, you will be able to perform the actions that you need to, for example, start your environment, deploy your environment, run the test cases, and so on. And finally, the blue box is the one reserved for the site manager. So it's not much used by the experimenters, let's say. Now, let's have a quick look at the experiment design, just to give you a practical example of what an experiment a blueprint is, okay? Well, let's start from the portal catalog here, where you can onboard the different blueprints of your experiment. So for the vertical services here, for the execution context here, for the test case here, and finally for the experiment blueprint here. If needed, you can also onboard your own virtual functions. This is the tab that you will need to use in this case. Now, let's check a vertical service blueprint. So here we have already onboarded a blueprint for one of the use cases that have been proposed in 5G, but our RS2T partners. It's basically a service that allows to track mobile user devices and determine the aggregated mobility flows in a smart city area in Turin, in our case. But let's have a closer look here, okay? So on the right side, you can see a graph with the functional components of the services. So in this case, tracker backend and the visualization tool, how they are interconnected. These are the networks that basically are interconnecting the service components, and the connection points that are exposed by the services. It's two, in this case, one for the management and one for the incoming traffic from mobile. We have also a number of fields that you can see here related to the vertical service blueprint. So, for example, the parameters field indicates the variables that you can configure through the descriptor. So in this case, it's the maximum number of mobile devices that the service is able to track in a given area. And you can customize this value when requesting a new experiment. We will see this later on. Okay. Other interesting fields are the compatible context blueprint and the compatible site. So this gives an idea basically of the execution context that can be associated to the service and the 5G facility where you can run the experiment. So in our case, it's quite clear, of course, we refer to the Italian side since the deployment of the physical backend of the service, the sensors and so on, is placed in Turin. So it's clear that the mobility flow taker needs to run there. But more in general, vertical services may be supported by multiple sites. Now, since we have mentioned the context blueprint, let's see an example for that. So in this case, we have a tool that can be used in the experiments to introduce an artificial delay. Delay that, of course, can be configured to emulate different running conditions and verify the performance of your service in different kinds of environments. So this is just an example, of course, but the catalog will offer several more tools, for example, traffic backend generators and so on. It depends on what will be available on the different sites. So now I'm not going into the details of all the different kinds of blueprints that we have defined, since more or less they follow the same principles. Just for completeness, let's have a quick look at the wizard that can be used to onboard the experiment blueprint. This is the wizard that we propose in our portal, and here the user is guided through all the steps to build it. So basically, after giving some general information, you can select the vertical service blueprint that you want to use, the execution context that you want to use, on board the network service descriptor to deploy your experiment, define the metrics and the KPIs, and finally select the test cases that you want to run. Very good. Now that more or less all the blueprint concept should be clear, I think that we can move on with our demo. So let's now wear the hat of the experimenter, let's say, that wants to request a new experiment. So to do this, we need to go back to the main page here, and we need to select the yellow box here. Now, in 5G, we support basically two mechanisms to define and request a new experiment. The first one is based on experiment descriptors. And basically here, you will need to provide values for all the variables that has been defined in the blueprint. But we offer also a more innovative approach, let's say, that is based on the declaration of an intent that can be expressed using the natural language. So we'll try this today. You need to go here. And let me just cut and paste a sentence that I've already prepared, and then we will see how everything works. So basically, this sentence, as you can see here, describes basically which experiment we need, in this case the RS2T experiments, where we want to execute it in Turin, when, and the configuration that we want. Everything expressed in natural language. So if we continue, basically it's the platform that interprets and translates our request. And as you can see here, it proposes a sort of configuration for our experiment instance that, of course, we can refine as needed and then submit the request. So, for example, let's select a delay that we want to introduce. Let's give a reasonable name for this. The date is okay, everything is fine, so let's submit. Very good. So as you can see here, basically we have created a new experiment descriptor with this ID, and we have also scheduled a new experiment instance. So we can go back to the portal homepage and have a closer look at the two items that have been created for us. If we go to the experiment descriptors, we can see here that we have this new descriptor that has been automatically created by the intent-based tool for our RS2T tracking experiments. So starting from this descriptor, the platform has also created a new experiment instance. And we can see it if we move to the experiment management section. So the red one here. Perfect. This is, as you can see, our new instance. It is in scheduling state. Scheduling state, that means that the site manager has still to accept the experiment and prepare the physical environment. So there is not much that the experimenter can do at this stage, just basically view the record as we have here. Now, then it will have to wait a bit for the site manager to act. Now, just for demo purposes, let's wear also the hat of the Italian site manager in Turin. Remember that we are using a super user with all the roles, so we can do that. Let's assume that everything is okay. The site facility is available. The requested time slot is fine. So the experiment can be accepted. We will use the manage site section to do that. This is our experiment in scheduling state. So let's accept it. And well, we can also assume that the environment is ready. Since the demo is running in a stub mode without the real infrastructure behind, of course, we have nothing to configure. So let's declare it ready. We submit. And now our experiment is ready. Then we can go back to the management page. And now, as you can see, the experimenter can proceed because our experiment is in ready state. Well, we have a new button here. You can use this to deploy your experiment. This is basically the first action that the experimenter has to do for building the service instance. Internally, the 5G platform will instantiate all the corresponding network services and configure the functions to host the experiment. Again, in this demo, all the NFV Manu platform at the backend are emulated, so the deployment is nearly immediate. Well, when working on the real infrastructure, you will have probably to wait a bit more for all the virtual machines to become active. But in our case, the service, as you can see here, is already instantiated. Now, once the experiment is instantiated, you can basically request an execution. Just to clarify, in this initial release, all the test cases are executed by default. So the related scripts are launched with the values configured in the descriptors. However, in the following releases, we will also offer a deeper granularity, and you will have the possibility to choose a subset of the test cases and adjust their configuration for each single execution. Okay, but now let's start new execution. You can do that using this button again. Let's select a meaningful name for that, and let's submit. Okay, again, we are not using a real infrastructure, so the execution is just emulated and we get an immediate response with some random results that we can visualize together with the details of the experiment in this view. Okay, so in our case, we have the test execution 1, it's been just executed, the status is completed. We had, for example, 2 test cases, one successful, the second one failed. Again, just some random results. But we can visualize also the details of our results. We can open the report here. So this is basically the page of our results analysis and validation system. As you can see, we have some statistics related to successful and failed test cases with some numbers here, minimum values, average value, maximum values. Again, these are just examples. Okay. We have details with different graphs about the KPIs, again, for the different test cases that we can select here. So this is for the normal one, this is the second one. As you can see, the graph is different. We can change again and so on. And you can, compare the different results for the different kind of configuration that you had in your test cases. And finally, in the performance diagnosis, you can see also some statistics related to the single nodes of the service. That's it. If we go back here to our experiment, when you have finished with your executions, of course, you can run more than one, so you can also select a new one, for example. If you go back here, you see you have another execution. When you have completed your experiment, you can also terminate it. So you go here, terminate, submit, and you will release your resources. Again, everything is nearly instantaneous. Probably it will take a bit more time in the real environment. And that's it. So if you have questions, more than welcome.
Hi, Giada. This is she.
Hello, she.
Hi. I have one question. So, if for the same experiment, can you run multiple instances and you can store the result and compare them? I mean, the same experiments.
Yes. When you create an experiment, you can run it several times. In the following release, you will also be able to configure the different executions, for example, to execute different test cases and adjust the configuration for the single test cases. Then you can compare the results.
So all the results of multiple runs, for example, you want to aggregate the statistics, can we also do that, or this need to be post-processed? I mean, how we can...
If you want to merge and combine monitoring data that belongs to different executions, you will need to do this manually if you want to combine them. If you want just to compare them, you have here the possibility to do this. So basically, it's enough to select the sub-test cases, and you can see them here. These are the KPIs, for example, for a specific test case. And if you change it, you see you have the other results. So you can compare them. If you want, on the other hand, to aggregate or post-process this, then you need to do this offline using other tools.
Okay, thanks.
You're
But
welcome.
that means for each experiment we are able to do, we can access the data like via a file. I mean, not only showing on the graphic interface, but also can get this as a data format and can process them.
Yes, you can perform some actions also using the APIs on the experiment. So, for example, to launch the execution of the experiment and so on, you can do that also using the APIs. And beyond the graphical visualization of the monitoring data, we are also designing mechanisms that will allow you to gather the raw monitoring data so that they will be able for your post-processing.
Is this API already developed for the monitoring?
For the monitoring, they will be not in the form of REST APIs, because we will have to actually, exchange a huge amount of data. So the REST APIs are not the most suitable ones to do that. So we are currently designing alternative solutions, but they are still in progress. So they will be probably available in the next releases of the system.
Okay, thank you, Giada.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Giada, for the nice presentation, and also to Manuel. We are a little bit ahead of time, so I think that there is room for further questions. So I haven't seen questions on the chat, but if you have questions, please. No questions? Okay, then I ask myself a question to Giada and Manuel, just to tell us about the further developments of this portal. So what we have already in the roadmap, as Manuel said, but in particular for the portal. Can we give some few details about this?
Giada, you can go ahead with this. As I was presenting, it is already available, and we are in the training moment for all of us in the project and for external projects to use it. What we have shown today is basically the surface of a big pillar of the system, because it's the same portal for all the sites, and that's enabled by the interworking layer, and deals with a number of heterogeneous infrastructure and vendors. So for us, the most difficult and hard part is in place. We're testing it, and we are also continuing the deployment of the 5G capabilities. But I leave it for Giada that she comments on the new things coming in the platform for the release of July 2020.
Yeah, so basically what we plan to do is to improve the part related to the monitoring and the performance validation. All the parts related to the automation of the experiment executions, and of course the extensions of our system to the different sites that we have in place in the 5G platform, in order, to improve also the number of tools that you will be able to use. We have seen just a couple of examples in this demo, but the idea is, of course, to improve our offer and our catalog, and also include some advanced mechanisms that will allow the experimenter to interact with the service and with the virtual environments of the service, in order to have a more dynamic adjustment of the test cases.
Okay, so are there any further questions?
I have
Oh, please.
Sorry, this is she again. I want to have a general question to both Manuel and Giada. So how is the plan of the portal and the API development for the next steps? In addition to the monitoring part, so for example, if the ICT-19 project requests to interact with the 5G, how is the further plan for the APIs?
Well, they will be available at least for the lifecycle management of the experiment. They will be available in the June release. So you will be able to access the system using the REST APIs, for example, for request the creation of experiment descriptor, for request the scheduling of new experiments, for launching the deployment of the virtual environment, and launching the test execution, retrieve the status query, for example, the values of the KPIs and so on. So all the actions that you have seen in this demo through the portal, the ones related to the life cycle management of the experiment, they will be also available through APIs.
So that means with the collaborative API, we can configure the lifecycle experiment. So we can configure in a way how to and when to schedule, and when to start or instantiate, and how to terminate as well.
Yes, exactly. And also you can start the execution of the test cases.
Okay, so for the moment, the API only provides us just to configure the experiment and run and instantiate once, but have to terminate manually.
No, no, also the termination will be available. So
Okay.
all the life cycle actions will be available, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chi, for the question. Other questions from other projects?
Hi, this is Giuseppe Mangas from CDC, also in Five Growth. I have a question, which is, there are some offline processes while the site manager is configuring for the experiment. So does this happen, like, if we use the APIs that you were just talking about? So can you skip this offline process because you already did it the first time, or how will that work when you use the APIs? How automated is the thing?
The part of the administrative configuration, let's say, will be still a manual configuration. So you will not be able to skip that. But what you can do with the REST API is basically to query for the status of the experiment, and as soon as it is ready, you will be able to proceed with the deployment and so on. I would also say that in most of the cases, I think that the initial part of the scheduling, let's say, of the experiments and the initial configuration will be something that will be done in a preliminary phase, and then you will start to interact, let's say, dynamically with the 5G system using the REST APIs, starting from the deployment part. That can be done when the physical environment is ready to run your experiment.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we have still time for a last question, if any. No other questions? Okay, so then let me summarize briefly. We have shown to you the general roadmap for the 5G project in the next months, and in particular related to the portal activity. We have shown to you the demo that was intended to be shown at the Mobile World Congress. If further details and further information will be shared soon, because we have a plan to organize a webinar intended to be a sort of training session. These will be scheduled in the second half of April. So soon the information will be circulated through the usual channels like 5G Comms and our portal, our internet website, our Twitter account. So I would like to thank you all then for attending the webinar today. Have a nice day and bye-bye.